Hello and welcome to Dukascopy TV. The long-term trade dispute between the US and China is at an all-time high. Could a massive trade war break out? That's the question. I am joined in the studio by John Hancock to ask his views on this. Welcome, John.
Thanks for having me.
So why is the rest of the world running on a trade surplus with China except for the US?
That's a good question, and it tends to cloud the debate of the US right now. Everyone focuses on the trade deficit with China. I think the reality is that China has become or has emerged as a massive assembling and manufacturing platform. So many countries that surround China are major suppliers to this giant global factory, the workshop of the world that's emerged in China. The goods are then shipped to the United States, which shows up as a trade deficit. So you're right, the picture is more complex than the numbers show. Massive trade deficit with the United States and recurring trade deficit, but trade surpluses with the Indonesias, Malaysias, Singapores of this world.
Thank you. And why is this dispute only surfacing right now?
It's another good question. I think if I had the short answer to that, I'd have the $1 million answer. One aspect of this is this recurring currency debate between China and the United States. The fact of the matter is that China, in a way like Germany and the EU, has pursued a fixed exchange rate policy, and there's some suggestion in the United States and elsewhere that this fixed exchange rate acts as a kind of a subsidy and gives China an unfair advantage in the US market. That's one explanation, and one that politicians in the US like to focus on. The bigger explanation, I think, is that we've lived through a giant credit-fueled boom. There's overcapacity in many sectors, huge sectors. We fixate on the housing sector in the United States or the commercial retail sector in many countries, but there's overcapacity in autos, there's overcapacity in consumer electronics, overcapacity in the basic inputs into computers. And now that the credit is drying up, and now that the stimulus is over, this bubble's contracting, and a lot of countries are turning to trade protectionism to try to protect their domestic economies.
And do you think this is causing a major problem for Barack Obama during his campaign?
Yeah, it's a great question. Of course it is. I mean, Barack Obama, he's running out of bullets. Interest rates are already remarkably low. I mean, essentially zero or less, depending on how you calculate it. Fiscal stimulus, although people like Paul Krugman keep calling for more fiscal stimulus, the real debate right now is how government can retrench in the United States. So what Barack Obama has turned to is exports. He said, we're going to export our way out of this crisis. That's a great strategy as long as other countries are willing to take your imports. And the sense that the trade picture is becoming more restrictive, that more and more countries are putting up barriers, makes it harder for Barack Obama to sell in states like Ohio or Michigan, especially Michigan. The auto sector, we're going to export our way out of this problem and export our way to jobs when China turns around and slaps anti-dumping or countervail duties on US auto exports, for example. It becomes a harder sell.
And exactly those duties, how badly is that going to affect the US economy?
It just remains to be seen, and bear in mind these are policies that China is talking about. It hasn't happened yet, but the duties range anywhere from 2% to 21%, and I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's going to be as much a political problem in this election cycle as an economic problem. Barack Obama is going to sell his policy as we are going to make the United States competitive again. The jobs that left in the auto sector are going to return. The question is, in a shrinking, a world of shrinking demand and potentially rising trade barriers, how credible is that policy?
And why do you think China failed to adhere to the WTO ruling to lift rare earth export restrictions?
That's a good question. This has been a very sensitive debate. As background, China is the world's major supplier by a long shot of rare earths, which are critical in a lot of high-tech production, everything from environmentally friendly cars to DVD players. And they hold the rare earths, and they have been accused of, by other trading partners, restricting the exports of these rare earths. I should caution that they are resisting implementing the WTO finally. They haven't refused to do that, and they're currently blocking a panel. So it remains to be seen whether they'll actually, how and in what schedule they'll conform with the panel. But it's an interesting question, because essentially what China is arguing is this is an environmental issue. We're doing this because we want to conserve our rare earths and because we don't want to pollute our environment. The trade partners are saying, no, you're not. What you're trying to do is attract inward investment and give an advantage to your own high-tech manufacturers by providing preferential access to these essential rare earths. So it's yet another example of a world where 3, 4, 5 years ago, everyone was talking about the sort of relentless march of globalization and more open markets. It's yet another example of where that picture is looking a little cloudier now. Countries are retrenching.
And what do you think will happen if a massive trade war does actually break out?
That would be a disaster. I mean, we are living in a world right now where there's almost a perfect storm of bad economic news. The U.S. recovery was fragile, and now there's big questions on whether it's sustainable. Europe, as we know, is in a self-imposed or self-executed crisis. There's questions whether China is slowing, and there seems to be clear signs that it is. So all of these engines of the global economic airplane are misfiring at the same time. If countries resort to trade protectionism to try to solve their problems, what they'll essentially be doing is exporting their problems, exporting their unemployment, exporting their underutilized factories, trying to deal with this overcapacity by shoving the problem onto someone else, what economists would call a beggar thy neighbor policy. And that will be disastrous because it never works. We learned that in the early 1930s during the Great Depression. Trade may not have caused the depression, but it's certainly made it much worse as countries raise trade barriers. So I think we should all be very frightened if this is the route that the world takes.
And what problems with other countries in terms of trade are we seeing at the moment?
Yeah, I think you're right to ask this, because it's not just a China-US problem. Brazil has had difficulties with Argentina and Mexico over auto imports. Argentina has announced a nationalization of a major petrochemical firm in Argentina. It's also imposed exchange restrictions on people trying to carry out exchange for trade transactions, using that as a hidden trade barrier. Russia's using preferential procurement policies on autos. There's a whole series of examples of countries reversing this trend towards more open markets and more integration, and there seems to be some worrying signs of them pulling back. So yeah, it's a global phenomenon.
Thank you so much for sharing your views on this today, John.
You're welcome. Thank you.
That's all we have time for right now, but stay tuned to Doireann TV for more exclusive interviews and press reviews. Goodbye for now.